The moment the file was opened, everything changed. Not because of what was inside, but because of the name on the label. Why would a woman at the center of a tightly controlled, high-profile family suddenly board a flight to another country in the middle of a homicide investigation, without a public explanation, without a statement, without even telling people closest to her where she was going? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. That question is where this story truly begins. Not with the crime scene, not with the arrests, not even with the vault. It begins with panic. Because when you understand what was allegedly found during the estate's search, and when you understand who knew about it before police ever did, that sudden flight stops looking random. It starts looking necessary. You see, investigators didn't go into the Brentwood estate expecting revelations. At that point, they believed the narrative was already written. 2 victims, a devastated family, a son arrested, a case moving steadily toward prosecution. Everything, on paper, appeared grim but straightforward. Until it wasn't. Because tucked away behind layers of security, beneath objects meant to preserve legacy rather than destroy it, was something that didn't belong in a family vault at all. Leverage. And according to investigators familiar with the search, one folder stood apart from the rest. No dates stamped across the top. No legal markings. No official seals. Just a handwritten label that immediately raised alarms. A name, a year, and a word that no one expected to see connected to this case. The name was Tracy. The year was 2015. And the word was incident. Ask yourself something. Why would anyone keep a file like that for nearly a decade, sealed, untouched, but carefully preserved? And more importantly, why would the discovery of that file allegedly trigger an international flight within days? This is not a story about a single decision. It's a story about fear catching up. Because long before police stepped onto the property, long before evidence bags were sealed and reports filed, there were secrets inside that house that had never been meant for daylight. And someone knew exactly what would happen if they were ever exposed. The estate search itself was, by all outward appearances, procedural. Officers moved room by room, cataloging items, documenting storage areas, securing anything that could be remotely relevant to the ongoing investigation. It was meticulous, slow, unremarkable, until they reached the vault. Now, vaults tell you a lot about people. They're not built for convenience. They're built for intention. What you place inside a vault is what you believe must survive fire, theft, time, and betrayal. In this case, the vault contained exactly what you'd expect from a man who lived a public life and a private one simultaneously. Documents, financial records, personal items tied to decades of work and relationships, things meant to be preserved. But then there was the folder. Thin, unassuming, different. According to sources close to the investigation, it wasn't even stored with the other documents. It was placed slightly apart, almost as if it didn't belong. Or as if it was meant to be found only by someone who already knew to look for it. That's the first contradiction that stands out. If the contents were explosive, why keep them at all? And if they were harmless, why isolate them? When officers opened the folder, they reportedly realized almost immediately that this wasn't evidence in the traditional sense. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't a crime report. It wasn't something meant for police. It was a record. Photos. Financial documents. Notes that didn't read like memory, but like preparation. And at the top of the internal index, a title that reframed everything. Tracy, 2015 yacht incident. At that moment, the investigation quietly split into 2 timelines. The public one, focused on the deaths, the arrests, and the courtroom future. And the private one, focused on understanding why a file like this existed at all. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. People don't keep blackmail files by accident. They don't hold on to compromising material for nearly 10 years unless it serves a purpose. And they don't label it so clearly unless they intend to find it again. The question investigators reportedly began asking wasn't what happened in 2015. It was why that year mattered now. You, watching this, might be wondering how something from nearly a decade ago could suddenly threaten the present. That's the trick of leverage. It doesn't expire. It waits. According to those who have reviewed descriptions of the file, the materials inside weren't designed to shock on their own. They were designed to connect dots. A photo without context. A payment without explanation. a note referencing a conversation that was never recorded. On their own, each item might look meaningless. Together, they tell a story. And that story, investigators believe, had never been meant for public consumption. So why hadn't it surfaced before? That question leads us to the man who allegedly created the file in the first place, Rob Reiner. Publicly, his reputation was built on influence, longevity, and control of narrative. Privately, according to those familiar with the vault's contents, he was meticulous about documentation, not to expose, but to retain options. That distinction matters, because there's a difference between revenge and insurance. Revenge is emotional, insurance is strategic. And everything about the way this file was stored suggests strategy, which brings us to the most unsettling part. The file had never been used. No threats sent, no leaks made, no confrontations triggered. It simply existed, waiting. And according to prosecutors, it may have stayed buried forever if not for one critical development, the estate search itself. Once the file was discovered, its existence could no longer be controlled by the person who created it. And that's where panic enters the story. Because someone outside law enforcement learned about the file before it became public. Someone whose name was on the label. According to investigative sources, word of the discovery reached Tracy through informal channels. Not official notification, not legal counsel, but whispers. And here's where the timeline tightens dramatically. Within a short window after that alleged warning, travel arrangements were made. No press statements. No advance notice. No explanation. Just a flight booked to Scotland. Ask yourself, if you were innocent and unafraid, would you leave? If you were guilty and exposed, would you stay? This is the paradox at the heart of the story. Because flight doesn't automatically mean guilt. Sometimes it means fear of misinterpretation. Sometimes it means legal strategy. Sometimes it means running from something that isn't even criminal, just devastating. But here's the detail that keeps investigators awake. The destination wasn't random. Scotland wasn't chosen for distance. It wasn't chosen for anonymity. It was chosen because it meant something. To Tracy, to the past, and possibly to what happened in 2015. At the same time, back in the United States, the family dynamic began to shift. Silence replaced statements. Avoidance replaced unity. And one person, in particular, became increasingly central to the unfolding narrative, Romy Reiner. According to reports, Romy was the one who alerted authorities to concerns about a dangerous family member. That alone altered the course of the investigation. But now, with the vault file in play, every prior warning took on new meaning. Were those concerns based on present behavior or knowledge of the past? And where did that leave Nick Reiner? Already arrested, already charged, already positioned as the center of the case. This is where the story grows darker, not because of violence, but because of implication. Because if the file represented leverage, then it also represented motive. Not necessarily for murder, but for silence, for pressure, for fear. And fear, as history shows us again and again, is often the most powerful force inside families. The sudden flight to Scotland didn't answer questions. It multiplied them. Why now? Why there? Why no explanation? And perhaps the most chilling question of all. What did Tracy believe would happen if she stayed? Because people don't flee from lies. They flee from truths they can't control. As prosecutors quietly reassessed timelines and defense teams recalibrated strategies, one realization began to surface. This case was no longer just about what happened on a single night. It was about what had been hidden for years. And as long as that file exists, the past isn't finished speaking. But what came next, what happened after Tracy landed in Scotland, would change the direction of this entire story. And no one saw it coming. But what came next, what happened after Tracy landed in Scotland, would change the direction of this entire story. And it starts back in Los Angeles. Because while one plane was crossing the Atlantic, something else was unfolding quietly, methodically, and with far greater consequences inside the Brentwood estate. Let me ask you something before we go any further. Have you ever noticed how the most dangerous discoveries don't announce themselves? They don't explode into headlines. They don't come with sirens or flashing lights. They reveal themselves slowly, almost politely, as if daring you to overlook them. That's exactly how the estate search began. On paper, it was routine, a continuation of an investigation already in motion. Officers weren't expecting surprises. They believed the emotional core of the case had already been exposed. Grief, shock, betrayal, and a son now facing charges. But cases don't end when arrests are made. Sometimes, they only begin to tell the truth afterward. The search team moved with the quiet efficiency of people who had done this dozens of times before. Drawers opened, closets documented, shelves photographed, boxes labeled. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming, until they reached the section of the house that wasn't designed to be searched at all. The vault. Vaults are different from safes. Safes protect valuables. Vaults protect intentions. They are built to outlast people. This one was discreet. No dramatic steel door. No cinematic keypad. Just a reinforced section of the home that blended seamlessly into the architecture. If you didn't know it was there, you'd walk past it without a second thought. Which raises the first uncomfortable question. Who didn't know it was there? Because vaults don't get discovered by accident. Someone points you to them. Someone mentions them. Someone remembers. When officers accessed it, they expected the usual collection of documents accumulated over decades. Contracts, financial records, personal effects tied to a long career and a complicated life. And that's exactly what they found. At first, everything inside was meticulously organized. Categories, subfolders, labels that made sense. The kind of order that suggests control, planning, a desire to leave nothing to chance. And then, tucked just slightly away from the rest, they saw it. A folder that didn't match. No official markings. No typed label. No institutional feel. Just handwriting. And when one officer lifted it from the shelf, the weight alone suggested it wasn't empty. Not thick enough to be a manuscript. Not thin enough to be meaningless. The label stopped everyone in the room. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was specific. A name, a year, an incident. If you're wondering why that matters, here's the thing. People don't name files like that unless they expect to remember them later. This wasn't nostalgia. This wasn't record keeping. This was preparation. Inside, investigators found a sequence of materials that immediately raised red flags. Not for what they accused, but for how deliberately they were assembled. Photos that appeared unrelated at first glance. Financial documents showing transactions that didn't align with public timelines. Handwritten notes that referenced conversations, locations, and moments that had never appeared in any public record. This wasn't a diary. It was a dossier. And dossiers are not created impulsively. They are built over time, which means someone had been collecting these materials slowly, intentionally, patiently. Ask yourself this. If you were planning to expose someone, would you wait 10 years? Of course not. Unless exposure was never the goal. Unless the goal was leverage. That realization reframed the entire discovery. This wasn't evidence of a crime. It was evidence of power. And power changes behavior in ways that are rarely visible until it's threatened. The moment officers began cataloging the contents, they understood something else. This file wasn't connected to the night of the murders. It existed long before. Which meant it wasn't reactive. It was premeditated. According to sources familiar with the search, the officers paused the inventory and contacted supervisors almost immediately. Not because they'd found a smoking gun, but because they'd found something more dangerous. Context. Because once you understand context, you start asking questions that don't fit neatly into charges and indictments. Why would someone keep this? Who was it meant for? And most importantly, what would happen if it ever became public? That last question may be the most important of all, because the moment this file was removed from the vault, its power shifted. It no longer belonged to the person who created it. And someone realized that very quickly. Now here's where the timeline gets unsettling. While officers were still processing the discovery, information about the file began to travel, not through official channels, but through people. Whispers, texts, phone calls that didn't last long. The kind of communication that happens when someone doesn't want a record. And according to investigative sources, one of those whispers reached Tracy, not through law enforcement, not through a lawyer, but through someone who understood exactly what that file represented. Think about that. Imagine knowing that a folder exists somewhere with your name on it. Imagine knowing it contains material collected for leverage. Imagine learning that it's no longer under the control of the person who created it. What would you do? Would you wait? Would you trust the process? Or would you act before the narrative was taken out of your hands? That's where the story pivots. Because from that moment on, Tracy's behavior reportedly changed. Communications became brief. Decisions became rapid. Plans were made quietly. And within a remarkably short window, travel arrangements appeared. Not domestic. International. A flight across the Atlantic. To Scotland. Why Scotland? That's the question that investigators couldn't ignore. Because Scotland wasn't a place of convenience. It wasn't the closest destination. It wasn't the safest legally. It wasn't even the most discreet. It was specific. And specificity always points to history. At the same time, back in the United States, the rest of the family was processing a different kind of shock. Because this discovery didn't just raise questions about Tracy. It reframed everything they thought they knew about the dynamics inside the house. About silence. About loyalty. About fear. And no one felt that shift more sharply than Romy Reiner. Romy's earlier warning to authorities about a dangerous family member who should be considered a suspect had already placed her in a complicated position. But now, with the vault file in play, that warning took on new weight. Was she reacting to behavior in the present? Or was she responding to knowledge of the past? Because here's the contradiction that investigators struggled with. If the file was leverage, then it created pressure. And pressure doesn't disappear. It builds. It reshapes relationships. It alters choices. It turns family members into liabilities. Which brings us to the person at the center of the legal case itself, Nick Reiner. Already arrested. Already charged. Already carrying the public weight of suspicion. But now, with this discovery, a new question emerged. Was Nick the cause of the family's collapse? Or was he part of a much larger implosion that had been years in the making? That question is uncomfortable, because it suggests that the events leading up to the murders may not have started days or weeks earlier, but years. In 2015, on a yacht, an incident that was never discussed publicly, an incident that someone thought was dangerous enough to document quietly and keep hidden. Why didn't it surface then? Why did it wait? And why did its discovery coincide so perfectly with Tracy's sudden departure? The official record won't answer those questions. But behavior might. Because behavior tells us what people fear. And fear tells us what matters. Tracy didn't give interviews. She didn't issue statements. She didn't clarify her intentions. She left. And in doing so, she transformed a hidden file into a central mystery. Because now, prosecutors weren't just asking what was in the vault. They were asking what else might exist. What copies might have been made. What conversations might have taken place long before police arrived. And whether the file was ever meant to be used, or whether its mere existence was enough to shape outcomes. As the investigation widened, one thing became clear. This case was no longer just about violence. It was about secrets. About the quiet kind of power that lives in folders and files and unspoken understandings. And if you think the discovery of that vault was shocking, wait until you hear what investigators began uncovering next. Because the file wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning. And what it pointed to, a 2015 yacht incident that no one wanted revisited, was about to surface in ways no one could control. And what that file pointed to, that 2015 yacht incident, was about to drag the past into the present whether anyone was ready or not. Because once investigators realized the file wasn't random, they stopped asking what it contained and started asking where it came from. Let me ask you something. If an incident is serious enough to document, but quiet enough to bury, who decides which parts of it survive? That question sat at the center of the next phase of the investigation. The moment the vault file was logged, analysts began reconstructing its origin story. Not the incident itself, not yet, but the behavior around it. Who collected the material, when it was added, and why it had never been touched again. The pattern was unsettling. The earliest materials in the folder dated back to months after 2015. Not immediately after the alleged yacht incident, but not years later either. That timing matters. It suggests the incident didn't trigger panic right away. It triggered caution. Think about that. Something happened. It didn't explode publicly. It didn't lead to legal action. Instead, it quietly changed how someone prepared for the future. That's not the response of someone reacting to scandal. That's the response of someone anticipating leverage. According to sources familiar with the contents, the materials weren't sensational in the way tabloids thrive on. There were no explicit images, no dramatic confessions, no single document that screamed Because leverage isn't about destruction. It's about control. Control over silence. Control over outcomes. Control over people who might otherwise act unpredictably. And control only works as long as everyone believes the leverage exists. Which brings us back to the moment Tracy allegedly learned about the file. Sources describe that realization not as explosive, but paralyzing. There was no shouting, no denial, no frantic damage control. There was calculation. Because denial only works when you control the narrative. And suddenly, she didn't. Within hours of that alleged warning, behavior changed in subtle but telling ways. Phone calls shortened, meetings canceled. A sense of urgency crept into decisions that had previously been deliberate. Then came the travel booking. Now here's something you need to understand about international flights under pressure. They leave a trail. Airlines log timestamps. Payment methods are recorded. Seat selections reflect intent. And according to people familiar with the booking, this wasn't a last-second scramble. It was fast, but it was deliberate, which suggests she didn't leave in panic. She left with a plan. The destination was Scotland. Not London, not Paris, not somewhere neutral. Scotland. Why does that matter? Because Scotland carries legal, cultural, and personal significance that most people wouldn't choose casually. It's a place where privacy can still exist, where public figures can blend more easily, where old relationships sometimes resurface quietly, and investigators began to wonder whether Scotland wasn't just an escape, but a return. At the same time, back in Los Angeles, the family dynamic fractured further. Silence spread. Statements that might have reassured the public never came. People stopped correcting rumors. They stopped denying things outright. And that silence spoke volumes. Because silence is rarely neutral. It's strategic. And the strategy seemed to be, wait. Wait for the investigation to move. Wait for the public attention to shift. Wait for the file to either surface or be dismissed. But files like this don't disappear. Once discovered, they change how every prior action is interpreted. Suddenly, conversations from years ago took on new meaning. Financial decisions looked different. Old tensions felt less spontaneous and more inevitable. Investigators began mapping relationships around the time of the alleged yacht incident. Who was present? Who left early? Who stayed silent afterward? And perhaps most tellingly, who changed their behavior in the months that followed? Because the aftermath of an incident often reveals more than the incident itself. According to those reviewing the timeline, there was a noticeable shift in family interactions after 2015. Not dramatic enough to attract attention. Not hostile enough to provoke confrontation. Just careful conversations, careful appearances, careful boundaries. That kind of caution doesn't come from nothing. It comes from knowledge. Which raises another uncomfortable question. Who else knew about the file? Because if Tracy learned about it through informal channels, that suggests more than one person was aware of its existence long before police found it. And if more than one person knew, then the file wasn't just leverage. It was currency, something that could be traded for silence, for loyalty, for compliance. That possibility reframed everything prosecutors thought they understood about motive. Because motives aren't always violent. Sometimes they're preventative. Sometimes people act not to cause harm, but to stop something worse from happening. And fear of exposure can push people into corners they never imagined occupying. As investigators dug deeper, attention returned again and again to that phrase on the folder. 2015 yacht incident. Why call it an incident? Not affair, not scandal, not crime. Incident. A word vague enough to deny specifics. A word flexible enough to mean different things to different people. And yet, specific enough to be remembered. That ambiguity wasn't accidental. It allowed the file to exist without committing to a narrative, which meant whoever created it was thinking ahead. Thinking about how stories evolve, how memories blur, how truth becomes harder to pin down with time. And that forward-thinking mindset is what makes the discovery so dangerous now. Because once the file entered evidence, its creator lost control of the story. And Tracy knew that. Which brings us to the moment she landed in Scotland. No press coverage, no photographers waiting, no public sightings, just absence. And absence is powerful. Because when someone disappears from a narrative, others fill the gap with speculation. Was she hiding? Was she preparing a defense? Was she seeking protection? Or was she simply distancing herself from a storm she knew was coming? Investigators couldn't answer those questions yet, but they did know one thing. The file had done its job, not by being used, but by being discovered, because discovery changes everything. It forces people to react. And reactions, more than documents, reveal the truth. As prosecutors began reviewing the contents alongside witness statements, they noticed something chilling. Certain behaviors described by family members years later aligned eerily well with the timeline suggested by the file. Moments of tension that once seemed trivial suddenly felt deliberate. Conversations that ended abruptly now looked rehearsed. And decisions that once felt impulsive now appeared calculated. Which leads to a question I want you to sit with. What if the murders weren't the origin of the family's collapse? What if they were the final chapter in a story that began years earlier, on a yacht, with an incident that was never supposed to be remembered? Because if that's true, then the vault wasn't just a storage space. It was a time capsule. And opening it didn't just expose secrets. It resurrected a past that someone had worked very hard to keep buried. But the most shocking twist hadn't surfaced yet. Because as investigators turned their attention to the yacht incident itself, they uncovered a detail that reframed everything they thought they knew. A detail that suggested the file wasn't just about Tracy. It was about someone else too. And when that name surfaced, the entire case shifted again. And when that other name surfaced, everything people thought they understood about the 2015 yacht incident began to unravel. Because until that moment, investigators believed the file told a singular story. One person, one secret, one source of leverage. They were wrong. Let me ask you something. What's more dangerous than being the subject of a blackmail file? Being connected to it without realizing you're in it. That realization didn't happen all at once. It emerged the way the truth often does in complex cases, slowly, uncomfortably, through contradictions no one could fully explain away. As analysts laid the file's contents out chronologically, they noticed something subtle but deeply unsettling. Certain materials didn't align with Tracy's timeline alone. Some documents referenced movements she couldn't have made. Some photos were taken from angles she couldn't have accessed. Some financial notations pointed to accounts she didn't control. At first, investigators assumed the materials were supplemental, context added later, loosely connected. But then a pattern formed. And patterns don't lie. The file wasn't documenting one person's actions. It was mapping relationships, which changes everything. Because leverage built on relationships is far more powerful than leverage built on individual mistakes. It means silence isn't enforced through fear alone. It's enforced through shared risk. As soon as that possibility emerged, the investigation widened dramatically. Suddenly, the question wasn't just what happened on that yacht in 2015. It was who else was there. And who had something to lose if the story resurfaced. Think about it. Incidents fade because they're inconvenient. They're buried because they're complex. They stay buried because multiple people benefit from forgetting. And forgetting requires cooperation. The file suggested that cooperation may not have been voluntary. According to sources familiar with the review process, one note inside the folder changed the tone of the room completely. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't accusatory. It was logistical. A brief handwritten line referencing a conversation that took place weeks after the yacht incident. No name spelled out, just initials. And a sentence fragment that read less like a threat and more like a reminder. Something along the lines of, "If this ever comes up again." That's all it said. No ending, no condition, just implication. And implications are powerful because they let the reader fill in the worst possible conclusion themselves. At that moment, investigators understood something critical. This file wasn't created to be shown. It was created to be remembered, to sit silently in the background of every interaction, to hover over conversations like an unspoken agreement. Which leads us to the most uncomfortable contradiction of all. If the file was leverage, and if it involved more than one person, then its power didn't end when its creator died. It transferred to whoever found it, to whoever controlled it next. And that realization sparked a quiet but urgent scramble. Because once prosecutors realized the file could implicate multiple individuals, the legal stakes escalated instantly. Now it wasn't just about motive. It was about exposure. Exposure doesn't just destroy reputations. It collapses narratives. And this case was built on narratives. The grieving family, the troubled son, the tragic end. But what if that story was incomplete? What if the real tension inside the family wasn't about the present, but about keeping the past buried? Investigators began revisiting witness statements with fresh eyes. Things that once felt vague now felt intentional. Phrases like unspoken understanding, descriptions of walking on eggshells, references to things we don't talk about. These weren't metaphors. They were clues. And when cross-referenced with the timeline suggested by the file, a chilling picture emerged. After 2015, relationships didn't explode. They tightened. Control increased. Boundaries hardened. Appearances became more curated. That's not the aftermath of a resolved issue. That's the aftermath of a suppressed one. And suppression comes at a cost. Emotionally, psychologically, eventually legally. Which brings us back to Tracy's flight. Because once investigators realized the file's implications extended beyond her alone, the decision to leave began to look less like avoidance and more like insulation. Distance creates delay. Delay creates options. And options matter when stories are about to resurface. Let's talk about Scotland again. Because the more investigators examined the choice, the less it looked accidental. Scotland offered something specific. Time. Time away from immediate questioning. Time away from informal pressure. Time to think. And thinking matters when your name is attached to a story that hasn't been told yet. While Tracy was overseas, prosecutors worked quietly to understand the scope of what they were dealing with. They didn't rush, because rushing creates mistakes. Instead, they began tracing the secondary connections suggested by the file. Who else had reason to fear exposure? Who else had adjusted behavior after 2015? And most importantly, who else might have known the file existed long before police did? That last question was the most dangerous, because if someone else knew about the file, and if they knew Tracy's name was on it, then the sudden flight wasn't just a personal decision. It was a signal. Signals are meant to be interpreted, and investigators believe it may have been interpreted exactly as intended. Silence followed. No public denials. No angry rebuttals. No frantic attempts to control the narrative. Just waiting. And waiting can be a strategy, but it can also be a mistake. Because as days passed, pressure mounted in places no one could see. Inside review rooms. Inside legal offices. Inside conversations that were never recorded. Prosecutors began to ask themselves a difficult question. What if the murders were not the catalyst, but the consequence? What if years of suppressed tension, fear of exposure, and unspoken agreements finally collapsed under their own weight? That doesn't excuse violence, but it contextualizes it. And context matters in court, which brings us to the role of silence within the family. Because silence isn't just absence of speech. It's an act of choice. And according to those familiar with the family dynamic, silence had become a defining feature long before the murders. Questions went unanswered. Concerns were redirected. Topics quietly disappeared. That kind of silence doesn't happen accidentally. It's maintained. And maintenance requires effort from everyone involved. Which leads us back to the other name implied by the file. The one investigators couldn't ignore. The one that complicated everything. Because if that person was connected to both the past incident and the present tragedy, then the case wasn't linear. It was cyclical. And cycles are hard to break, especially when breaking them threatens to expose truths that have been carefully managed for years. As Scotland remained quiet, investigators prepared for the next phase. They weren't ready to confront anyone yet. They were still mapping, still connecting, still asking the most dangerous question of all. Who benefits from the story staying simple? Because simple stories protect people. Complex ones expose them. And this case was no longer simple. Not with a vault file that hinted at shared secrets. Not with a sudden international departure. Not with timelines that refused to stay confined to the present. The past was pushing forward. And it wasn't done. Because as prosecutors dug deeper into the yacht incident itself, into who was present, who paid for what, and who left early, they uncovered a detail that changed how the incident was classified entirely. Not as a scandal, not as an affair, but as something that could carry legal consequences if ever formally examined. And that realization sent a shockwave through the investigation. Because once an incident crosses that line, silence is no longer protection. It's risk. And the next move, the one investigators were preparing to make, would force someone to break that silence, whether they were ready or not. And that's when the word incident stopped being vague. Because once investigators realized the 2015 yacht event could carry legal consequences, everything changed, not just for Tracy, but for everyone orbiting that moment in time. Let me ask you something. Have you ever noticed how powerful people rely on ambiguity? Not lies, not denials. Ambiguity. Because ambiguity keeps doors open. It allows explanations to shift. It lets everyone pretend they misunderstood. But legality doesn't tolerate ambiguity. Once something crosses into that territory, the story hardens. And that's exactly what began to happen. Up until this point, the yacht incident had existed in a gray zone. Uncomfortable, yes. Damaging if exposed, certainly. But prosecutable? That question had never been asked out loud. Now it was unavoidable. As analysts reconstructed the event using fragments from the file, witness recollections, and travel records, they noticed something deeply troubling. The incident wasn't isolated. It had a before, and it had an after, which meant it wasn't just something that happened. It was something that unfolded. According to sources familiar with the internal review, the yacht wasn't just a location, it was a stage. A place where boundaries blurred because everyone assumed discretion would protect them. Private charters create illusions. No cameras, no public manifests, no witnesses who want to be witnesses. And yet, the file suggested that discretion had failed. Not publicly, privately, because someone had documented the moment when things shifted from consensual to questionable. That distinction matters, and it's where the legal danger emerged. As investigators began cross-referencing the timeline of the yacht incident with later financial movements, they noticed a sequence that raised immediate concern. Payments that didn't align with services. Transfers that appeared reactive rather than routine. Amounts that were small enough to avoid scrutiny, but consistent enough to suggest purpose. This wasn't hush money in the cinematic sense. It was something quieter. Support. Assistance. Help given in moments when silence was more valuable than explanation. And silence, when purchased, becomes evidence. That realization forced prosecutors to reconsider how they viewed the family's internal dynamics. Because if silence had been maintained through years of subtle pressure, then the murders couldn't be examined in isolation. They were part of a longer continuum of fear and control. Let's pause here, because this is where viewers often split. Some will say this is speculation. Others will say it explains everything. But investigators aren't interested in opinions. They're interested in patterns. And the patterns were becoming harder to ignore. The file referenced meetings that took place after the yacht incident. Not confrontations. Not accusations. Meetings. That alone is telling. People meet to resolve problems quietly. They meet to negotiate. They meet to make things go away. And according to the notes, those meetings involved more than two people. Which means the incident didn't stay contained. It spread. Now ask yourself this. If multiple people are invested in keeping something buried, what happens when the leverage holding them together disappears? The answer is rarely calm. It's chaos. Because leverage doesn't just restrain behavior. It defines it. For years, according to those close to the family, relationships appeared functional on the surface. Public appearances continued. Professional obligations were met. Smiles were maintained. But privately, tension simmered. People avoided certain topics. Certain trips were never discussed. Certain names were never spoken aloud. That kind of avoidance becomes a pressure cooker. And pressure cookers don't release steam gradually. They explode. Now let's talk about timing. Because timing is everything in this story. The yacht incident occurred in 2015. The file was assembled shortly afterward. Silence followed. Years passed. Then, suddenly, the file was discovered during an estate search tied to a double homicide. And within days, Tracy left the country. That sequence is not random. It's reactive. And reaction implies fear. But fear of what? Legal exposure is one possibility. Public humiliation is another. But investigators believe there was something else driving the urgency. Something more immediate. Because when Tracy left, she didn't just distance herself from the investigation. She distanced herself from the narrative. She removed herself from the flow of information. That's significant. Because narratives are shaped by proximity. The closer you are, the more pressure you face to respond, explain, or contradict. Distance buys time. Time to prepare. Time to consult. Time to decide what version of events you're willing to stand behind. And Scotland wasn't just distance. It was jurisdictional complexity. Different legal. This person wasn't named in the file. They weren't a central figure. They were peripheral, which made them dangerous. Because peripheral witnesses often have the clearest view. They're not invested in protecting anyone. They're invested in protecting themselves. And according to sources, this witness began asking questions, quiet ones, through intermediaries, about whether the statute of limitations applied, about whether cooperation would matter, about whether silence was still the safest option. Those questions didn't go unnoticed. Because when someone starts asking legal questions, it signals intent. And intent changes how investigators move. Suddenly, the file wasn't just historical context. It was leverage that could flip. And leverage, once it starts moving, doesn't stop cleanly. It pulls everyone with it. As prosecutors weighed their next steps, they realized something else. If the odd incident became public, it wouldn't just affect Tracy. It would affect how the jury perceived the entire family. It would complicate motives. It would muddy sympathies. And it would introduce a narrative of long-term secrecy that could influence every testimony. That's powerful, which is why silence had been maintained for so long. But silence is fragile, and it breaks when fear outweighs loyalty. That balance was shifting. Because while Tracy remained abroad, others were left to manage the fallout. Phone calls intensified. Legal teams coordinated. People began preparing for questions they hoped would never be asked. And one question loomed larger than all the others. Who was going to speak first? Because in cases like this, the first voice often defines the story. Everyone else reacts to it. And according to investigative sources, someone was preparing to speak. Not publicly, not yet, but to authorities. Which would change everything. Because once one person breaks the silence, leverage loses its power. Secrets stop being currency, and narratives collapse. As the investigation approached that tipping point, prosecutors made a quiet decision. They would test the silence. They would apply pressure in places no one expected. And the move they were preparing to make would force a response from someone who had stayed in the shadows for nearly a decade. A response that would either confirm the file's implications or expose an entirely new layer of deception. And when that response comes, the story will no longer be controlled by vaults, flights, or carefully chosen words. It will be controlled by testimony. And testimony has a way of rewriting history. And testimony is where carefully managed stories go to die. Because once someone starts talking under oath, ambiguity collapses. Words harden. Timelines solidify. And the thing everyone agreed not to name suddenly has to be described. That's the pressure prosecutors were preparing to apply. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly. Let me ask you something. Why do people stay silent for years and then suddenly speak? It's rarely about courage. It's about safety. And safety is a calculation. Up until now, silence had been the safest option for everyone connected to the 2015 yacht incident. Silence protected reputations. Silence preserved relationships. Silence kept the past where it belonged. But the moment the vault file was discovered, the math changed. Because silence only works when no one else has leverage. And now, the leverage had shifted. Investigators understood that pushing too hard, too fast could backfire. It could spook witnesses. It could trigger legal countermeasures. It could fracture a case that was already complex. So instead, they chose something subtler. They identified pressure points. Not the central figures. Not the obvious ones. Peripheral people. The ones who had been close enough to know something, but distant enough to walk away if given the chance. And that's where the silence began to crack. According to sources familiar with the investigation, prosecutors initiated what looked, on the surface, like routine follow-ups, clarifying questions, timeline confirmations, requests for records that seemed innocuous. But these weren't random. They were designed to send a message. We know this didn't happen in isolation. We know it connects to something older, and we are willing to go there. That message traveled fast, because people talk, not to the press, not publicly, to each other. And once those conversations started, fear began to outweigh loyalty. Here's the contradiction investigators noticed almost immediately. The people most worried weren't the ones named directly in the file. They were the ones adjacent to it. Because adjacency means uncertainty. It means not knowing how much you're implicated, not knowing what someone else might say, not knowing whether silence still protects you. And uncertainty is unbearable. That's when questions started reaching legal offices. Quiet ones, hypothetical ones. Questions like, If something happened years ago and no charges were filed, does cooperation still matter? Or, if my involvement was limited, am I better off clarifying that now? Those questions don't come from people who feel safe. They come from people who feel exposed. As that undercurrent grew, investigators turned their attention back to Tracy's absence. Because absence, in moments like this, becomes its own form of testimony. Let's talk about what she didn't do. She didn't issue a denial. She didn't release a statement expressing confidence in the investigation. She didn't publicly distance herself from the file. Instead, she stayed quiet and stayed abroad. Now, silence can mean many things. But combined with distance, it sends a clear signal. Wait. Wait to see what surfaces. Wait to see who speaks. Wait to see which version of the story gains traction. That waiting period is critical, because it's when narratives are born. And while Tracy waited, others couldn't. Because they were still here, still subject to questions, still fielding calls, still watching the story shift around them. Inside the family, according to people familiar with the dynamic, conversations grew tense. Not confrontational, controlled. Everyone measuring what they said, everyone listening for what wasn't said. And that atmosphere does something dangerous. It erodes trust. Because when people stop trusting each other to maintain silence, they start protecting themselves instead. Protection can look like cooperation, which brings us to the move prosecutors finally made. They didn't subpoena anyone connected directly to the yacht incident. Not yet. Instead, they requested records. Records that seemed unrelated at first glance. Travel manifests, financial disclosures, communication logs tied to dates surrounding the incident. On their own, these requests were unremarkable. Together, they formed a net. And nets are meant to close. As records began coming in, something became clear. The yacht incident wasn't just remembered differently by different people. It had been compartmentalized. Everyone knew a piece. No one knew the whole, which is exactly how secrets survive. But compartmentalization only works until someone compares notes. And that's what the file allowed investigators to do. They used it as a reference point, not to accuse, but to align. Does this date match your recollection? Does this location make sense with your timeline? Who else was present when this conversation happened? Slowly, carefully, they began assembling a mosaic. And the picture that emerged wasn't sensational. It was procedural, which is far more dangerous. Because procedural truths don't rely on drama. They rely on consistency. And the consistency was there. What investigators saw suggested that after the yacht incident, there was an unspoken agreement to maintain distance. Not from each other, but from the truth. No official statements. No formal resolutions. Just a quiet shift in behavior. And that shift persisted for years. Until it didn't. Because once the murders occurred, the house was searched. Once the house was searched, the vault was opened. Once the vault was opened, the file was discovered. And once the file was discovered, silence stopped being safe. That's the chain reaction no one anticipated. Now let's address the most uncomfortable question. Why keep the file at all? If the incident was resolved, why not destroy it? Investigators believe the answer lies in control. Because control isn't about using leverage. It's about knowing you can. The file didn't need to be deployed to be effective. Its existence alone shaped behavior. But existence only matters if people believe it's hidden. The moment it wasn't, its power flipped. From private control to public risk. That flip is what sent Tracy to Scotland. Not guilt, not confession, risk management. Because once risk becomes public, the calculus changes. And Scotland offered something that the US no longer could. Space. Space to observe. Space to plan. Space to decide whether to speak or continue waiting. But waiting isn't passive. It's strategic. And investigators knew that, which is why they didn't rush to confront her. Instead, they focused on creating conditions where someone else would speak first. Because the first person to talk controls the frame. And according to sources close to the investigation, that moment was approaching. A peripheral witness, someone who had nothing to gain from continued silence, was preparing to formalize what they knew. Not in a press interview, not in a leak, but in a setting where lies carry consequences. That possibility sent shockwaves through the remaining silence. Because once testimony enters the record, it doesn't disappear. It becomes reference. It becomes context. It becomes something future witnesses must respond to. And that's when leverage truly dies. Because leverage only works when everyone agrees not to test it. As the days passed, prosecutors began preparing for a scenario they hadn't initially planned for. What if the yacht incident became part of the trial narrative? Not as a charge, not as an accusation, but as background. Background that explains motive. Background that explains fear. Background that explains why people behave the way they did. That possibility terrified defense teams. Because juries don't just evaluate evidence, they evaluate stories. And stories with long histories of secrecy don't inspire sympathy. Which leads us to the moment the investigation crossed a line. Prosecutors requested a formal interview with someone connected to the 2015 incident. Not Tracy, not yet, someone else. Someone who had stayed quiet long enough to believe they were forgotten. That request was polite, optional, but its implications were anything but, because it signaled that the silence was over, that the file was no longer dormant, that the past was officially in play. And once that door opens, it doesn't close cleanly. So now we're at a tipping point. A family fractured by years of unspoken agreements. A vault file that refused to stay buried. An international absence that raised more questions than it answered. And somewhere between Scotland and Los Angeles, someone is deciding whether to speak. Because the next voice to break the silence will determine what this story becomes. A contained tragedy. Or a sprawling reckoning. And when that voice finally speaks, it won't just change how the past is understood. It will change what happens next. And when that voice finally did speak, it didn't come with drama. It came with paperwork. Let me ask you something. What scares people more, an accusation or a request to clarify the record? Because accusations can be fought. Clarifications lock you into details. That's the move prosecutors made next. Not a subpoena, not a warrant, a request. A request framed as routine. A conversation positioned as voluntary. But everyone involved understood what it really meant. The silence was no longer assumed. It had to be justified. According to sources close to the investigation, the individual contacted was not a central figure in the family, not a public face, not someone accustomed to scrutiny. That's why they were chosen. Peripheral witnesses don't have media training. They don't have long-standing legal teams. They don't have reputations carefully insulated from risk. They have memories. And memories, when questioned carefully, tend to spill. The request outlined a narrow scope, a short window of time, specific dates surrounding the 2015 yacht trip. Nothing more, nothing less. And that narrowness was intentional. Because broad questions allow evasion. Narrow questions trap you inside your own recollection. When the witness agreed to speak, investigators didn't rush. They let the person talk. They let them wander. They let them contradict themselves. Because contradictions aren't weaknesses. They're doorways. At first, the account was familiar. Nothing unusual. Nothing alarming. Just a gathering. A trip. A moment in time that didn't seem important then. But as the conversation continued, details began to sharpen. Who stood where? Who left early? Who stayed behind? And most importantly, who appeared uncomfortable when certain topics came up later. That's when the witness paused. And pauses are telling. Because pauses don't mean forgetting. They mean deciding. The witness reportedly asked a question of their own. Is this about the murders? That question changed the temperature in the room. Because it revealed something crucial. The witness already knew these events were connected, even if they didn't yet understand how. Investigators answered honestly. This is about understanding the full context. Context. That word again. The witness continued. Slowly at first. Then with growing clarity. They described a moment on the yacht when the atmosphere shifted, when laughter died down, when the energy changed in a way that couldn't be explained by alcohol or fatigue. A moment that didn't look dramatic, but felt wrong. This wasn't an accusation. It was an observation. And observations, when they come from someone with nothing to gain, carry weight. The witness described people exchanging looks. Not panicked ones, measured ones. The kind of looks that say, we'll deal with this later. Later, as it turned out, lasted years. When investigators compared this account with the materials in the vault file, something clicked. The timing aligned. The language matched. Even the vague phrasing in the file, incident, suddenly made sense. It wasn't labeled that way to obscure. It was labeled that way to accommodate different interpretations, to allow everyone involved to agree on silence without agreeing on what happened. That's how fragile coalitions survive. But fragility doesn't mean permanence. As the interview continued, the witness mentioned something else. Something that hadn't appeared in the file. A conversation that took place weeks after the yacht trip. Not confrontational, not emotional, practical. They recalled someone saying, almost casually, "This doesn't need to become a thing." That sentence is devastating in its simplicity because it implies choice. Choice to address, choice to ignore, choice to suppress. And suppression, once chosen, becomes a shared responsibility. That's when investigators realized the file wasn't just leverage over Tracy. It was leverage over everyone who agreed to let it disappear, which reframes her sudden flight entirely. Because if Tracy believed the silence pact was collapsing, leaving wasn't just self-protection. It was an acknowledgement that the agreement no longer held. Back in the US, word of the interview spread quietly, not publicly, internally. And when it did, the tone of conversations changed again. People stopped asking whether the yacht incident would matter. They started asking when. Defense teams adjusted strategies, not to deny the incident, but to minimize its relevance. Because relevance is the battlefield. If the incident could be framed as unrelated, the case stayed contained. If it became context, everything expanded. That's the line prosecutors were walking, and it wasn't an easy one. Because context cuts both ways. It can explain behavior, but it can also complicate narratives of innocence. As additional interviews were scheduled, investigators noticed a shift. People were no longer surprised by the questions. They were prepared. That preparation told its own story. Because people don't prepare for things they believe are irrelevant. They prepare for threats. And the threat here wasn't criminal charges. It was exposure. Exposure of years of silence. Of complicity through inaction. Of choices made to protect reputations rather than resolve harm. That kind of exposure changes how juries listen. It changes how families are perceived. And it changes how responsibility is assigned. Meanwhile, Tracy remained abroad. No public appearances. No statements. No visible engagement with the unfolding narrative. But absence doesn't mean inactivity. Sources indicate she was consulting. With whom, and about what, remains unclear. But consultations signal preparation. Preparation for a moment everyone knows is coming. Because once one witness speaks, others follow. Not out of loyalty, out of fear of being last. And being last is dangerous. Because the last person to speak doesn't shape the story. They defend against it. That's the pressure Tracy was facing from afar. Not a knock on the door. A ticking clock. And clocks don't stop just because you're not there to hear them. As prosecutors continued building their contextual case, they made a quiet but significant decision. They would not introduce the yacht incident as a central element. Not yet. Instead, they would let it sit beneath the surface. Available. Referenced. Waiting. Because sometimes the most powerful evidence is the kind that doesn't need to be emphasized. It just needs to exist. And exist it did. In records. In testimony. In memories that were no longer private. The next phase would determine whether Tracy would remain a silent observer or be pulled directly into the process. Because at some point, distance stops protecting you. It starts isolating you. And isolation forces decisions. Decisions like whether to speak first, whether to continue waiting, or whether to return. Because returning would change everything. It would shift the narrative from speculation to confrontation. And investigators were quietly preparing for that possibility. Because the moment Tracy sets foot back on U.S. soil, the silence that protected everyone for nearly a decade will be tested in ways it never has before. And when that test comes, someone will blink. The only question is who. And when they do, the story will finally move from whispers and files into something far more dangerous. Statements. And statements are where control finally slips. Because once words are spoken into the record, they stop belonging to the person who said them. Let me ask you something. Why do people delay giving statements when they believe they've done nothing wrong? It's not fear of truth. It's fear of interpretation. Because interpretation is where stories get rewritten. And right now, everyone connected to this case understood one thing very clearly. The story was no longer theirs to manage. As the first formal statement was logged, investigators noticed something immediately. The tone had changed. This wasn't denial. This wasn't outrage. This wasn't confusion. It was careful language.